Delighted to welcome you to our first of three workshops focusing on strengthening research capacity through collaborations with the Global South through the ICARA network. My name is Dr. Andy Mohan, and I am the ICARA president. And I'm really happy to be joined today by our distinguished speakers, who I will introduce properly in a few minutes' time. But that's Professor Monica Swan and Professor Abjit Nadkarni. I'm also joined by our ICARA team. So I'd like to also welcome Dr. Isa Uni, Ms. Ashley McDougall, Mate Kose, Professor Neo Moragele, and Professor Joel Francis as well. We have for this particular project, this is funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and we received this June last year, and this is one of their research collaboration grants. And the aim of this grant is to foster Global South, Global North collaborations in alcohol research through enhancing the ICARA network. So this project is really split into two parts. We have three workshops, the first of which is today, of course, focusing on identifying funding sources and writing collaborative research proposals. We are going to have an in-person workshop as part of the Kettle Brewing Society Conference or the KBS Conference in Glasgow in June. So if you are attending that conference, please do look out for our workshop and sign up to it. And this is going to be focused on research methods for interdisciplinary collaborative research in alcohol. And then we will have a third workshop. We haven't confirmed the date as yet, but this will focus on research translation, which supports the adoption and implementation of evidence-based and contextual alcohol policies. The second part of this project is really about enhancing our ICARA website to function as a sort of like super networking tool for researchers who are focused on alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. So in 2023, we ran a series of workshops with people from all over the world asking what is one of the things they would really appreciate. And one of the things was about just making it easier for to network, to connect with people, to identify researchers in a specific field, from a specific background, from a specific country. So we're hoping that once we get this function running, that any researcher anywhere can sign up to register their profiles on our website to aid in this collaborative endeavor. So that's our Royal Society project. And as part of that, we are happy to have Ashley McDougall, who is our project administrator, who is here today. She will be supporting us with the entire project, and we're really happy to have her on board. So, I don't know, a slide is missing from this, and this is why you double check, but I'm just going to go ahead now. I don't know why, so apologies. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our two speakers now. So our first speaker is Professor Monica Swan, who is the Dean of the Wellsell College of Health and Human Services at Kennesaw State University, USA. She is trained as a psychiatric and alcohol epidemiologist and specializes in global health research, focusing on adolescent and women's health, violence prevention, and alcohol use in underserved urban settings, primarily in Africa. Her research aims to develop and evaluate interventions addressing alcohol-related harm, gender-based violence, mental health, and health disparities, with long-standing collaborations with research institutions and community-based organizations in Uganda. Our second speaker, Professor Abjit Nadkarni, is an NIHR Professor of Global Health Research and Professor of Global Mental Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, UK. He is also the co-director of the Center for Global Mental Health at LSHTM and King's College London. He is an addiction psychiatrist, sorry about that, psychiatrist and global mental health researcher, conducting research aimed at developing and evaluating interventions for increasing access to mental health care in low-resource settings. His host institution is in India is Sangath, a mental health research NGO, where he is the co-director of the Addictions and Related Research Group. And we're really, really very happy to welcome both professors today with us. So I will now pass on to Monica to begin her presentation. Thank you so much, Monica.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's really a pleasure and privilege to be part of this meeting. I only have a few minutes to sort of share some tips that I have, I guess, learned over the years or experiences. Can you see my screen fine? So fantastic. So I'm just going to spend the next 10 or so minutes talking about, some tips and tricks or perhaps strategies, because I think in the funding environment that we're all experiencing, particularly here in the United States where I am, the funding landscape has changed quite substantially in just the last couple months. And so I think if there's anything we need to use that Q&A session for after is really to strategize to see how we can move the field forward. So I have worked in Africa, particularly East Africa, for a long time. And as I'm trained as an alcohol epidemiologist, it's been a longstanding interest of mine. But I included this picture from a Uganda, what we call a Malwa joint. And so unrecorded alcohol being sold in these small settings. And very difficult to measure, very difficult to prevent. But that's kind of the context that I've been working for almost 20 years. So again, I think everybody probably on this call knows very well that the burden of alcohol use and alcohol-related harm has significantly increased. It's been growing over the years in many parts of the world. And the COVID pandemic really contributed to that quite a bit. But there's also a tremendous funding gap. So if we look at how prevalent alcohol use is and what the harm it's causing, there is very, very little funding available for alcohol research specifically, and hence our need for really strategize and also linking to other health concerns. So again, the purpose of this is just to give you some insight, what I have learned. I have been very blessed and fortunate with strong research teams and funding for some years to do alcohol and other types of research. So had a couple weeks ago, had we had this talk perhaps in December, I would have highlighted the National Institute of Health here, you're part of the US government, and there's substantial funding available for international work, particularly through Fogarty and also their National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. The word of wisdom for the last however many years were that if you wanted to do alcohol research and you could demonstrate the positive impact in other parts of the world that would be related to the US, you would have a good chance of getting that funding. Also, if you tied it to HIV research, it was more likely to be funded, and I've used that strategy myself. But if you follow the news, you know that the US has been cutting a lot of those global initiatives. But outside of the US, obviously, we have WHO, we have, institutions in the UK, there's the World Bank, there's the Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust funds, a lot of mental health research. They're also out of the UK. And there are various philanthropies. But typically, they don't list alcohol as one of their key features that they want to fund. So one would have to think strategically about other health concerns. There's been a movement also in cancer prevention to really look at alcohol as one of the major risk factors for alcohol. So encourage that kind of thinking. And when we think about funding, most of us like to get grants because grants mean that we have autonomy to do the work that we have presented. But there are all kinds of other grants too, collaborative agreements. There are obviously, capacity building strategies. But again, they're typically not aligned with alcohol specifically or with any substance use. And so, again, we have to think strategically about what it means to build the infrastructure. And perhaps it's about addressing chronic diseases more broadly, as an example. So again, if you are lucky to find a funding mechanism that really fits your intent, it is really, really important to develop a very strong proposal that aligns exactly with what the funder is hoping to fund. And, I'm so often, as I'm working in this space, surprised how many people don't check with the funder, to check with whoever is overseeing a grant program or the philanthropic arm of the institution, to really make sure that their strategic goals are met. Because again, we can write a beautiful proposal, it takes a lot of time, but again, if it's not aligned, it will never be funded. And so those prep steps or preparation and really engagement, it is really, really key. But again, working with ICARA here, I think one of the things that we need to do is keep pushing for alcohol research to be funded, given its link with so many different types of harm. So leveraging networks and collaborations and always reminding people of that, right? That those are things that we can do collectively, and I think need to really level up in this kind of environment. Again, the tips, if you will, for writing, whether it's an alcohol research proposal or any kind of proposal, again, is to define the relevance. As we're thinking about funding, or as part of this webinar, is really building, global South capacity. If we're looking for funding from the global North, for example, clarifying exactly what the value added is to the country that is funding it, particularly if we're using tax funds, as we've done in the United States, to really link those priorities and the impact. And so very often we highlight our great ideas, but we don't take it to the whole spectrum. Again, what's the impact going to be? Well, what do we hope it to be? And of course, it goes without saying, and I think the next speakers will talk quite a bit about this, about local partnerships and collaborations, making sure that they're there, and also making sure that they're ethically distributed, and making sure that, again, that capacity building is very intentional. Sustainability and scalability is very hard usually for a research grant to talk about the future when funding ends, but the extent at which we can build that in, that is usually exciting to most funders, because again, they don't want to just do a research project and withdraw. But again, how can you build that in, especially for in low resource settings? And then the budget. I see a lot of concerns about budgets when I review grants, is that people often sort of like, trust me, I know how to do this, I'm going to spend the money well. But funders usually want to see a really, really clear plan. And again, I would criticize my US colleagues, whatever, who when they go to more low resource settings, right? We need to scale the budget for the low resource setting, not for the, say, the US setting, if that makes sense. And again, the pitfalls to avoid, and I see this often as I review grants, and actually I'm doing a review for NIH next week for a panel on mental health. And often people get carried away with the research ideas. There's something somebody really, really, really wants to do, but if it's not aligned again with what the funder wants to do, it just never will be funded, no matter how well written or however great expertise the team has. So again, I say that because I see that all the time. Also, again, here in the global North, lack of local input, right? That is now in this environment in global health, that is really unacceptable. And again, weak justification of budget. It's very hard. It's very hard to do a budget before you have really, explored all angles of a project, or if you've not been immersed in the setting where the work will be done. So strong justification really needs to be done there. So again, sort of if I had to just summarize it into 5 things, is so important for alcohol, for any other topic, right, is to align the research with the real world priorities in the local context, to frame alcohol research within the broader health and policy agendas. That's because there are so few alcohol dollars for prevention research available. And so again, if you can tie it to cancer or to broader mental health or to HIV or any other topic where there is more funding available, that is highly recommended. Again, cannot ignore funders' priorities and funding language, right? That is key. So read the funding announcement multiple times, or talk to them to make sure that the idea is viable and fundable, because again, it takes so much time to prepare these. And then, of course, in terms of the collaborations, really be clear what that collaboration entails, right? It needs to have rigor, needs to have equity. And the more that can be spelled up front in the proposal, because when the money comes in, everybody now has a much more vested interest, and it's hard to renegotiate the terms if the proposal has already been approved for funding. And then ideally, if one can, to build sustainability and long-term impact into these projects, right? Again, so that the good news or the interventions, whatever we're testing, is not going away. But I also realize that's one of the key challenges. Very, very hard to do that in this funding landscape. But the biggest one is do not underestimate how long it takes to draft a strong and fundable proposal. I get invitations all the time, like something is due next week, next month. And for these big grant proposals that have substantial funding, you have to really allow multiple months to do that, and preferably also to go visit and check with everybody and get the letters of support and all those things that are needed. I took this one. I didn't have time to fix it this morning, but a project that I'm currently running, even though it was not funded specifically for alcohol research, there are great opportunities to leverage existing projects as a low cost or maybe no cost strategy for building the research platform and to making the case for why more research is needed. So I welcome anybody to reach out to the projects that I currently have if anybody has ideas and it fits with the overall mission. In my case, I'm doing longitudinal surveys of young women in Kampala, and so we do have a range of alcohol measures. So with that, my time is up, and I say thank you, but I always welcome collaborations and glad to take more questions in the Q&A, but you can feel free to reach out to me, via email or WhatsApp, after this. So really grateful to share sort of some quick ideas.
That's great. Thank you so much, Monica, for that. And I know a lot of people will have questions, so we'll move on to Abhijit first. So Abhijit, over to you. Thank you so much.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for inviting me for this webinar. It's always great to interact with new people doing work within the space and also learn from people's experiences. So my mandate was to kind of talk about writing I don't know, winning, but at least good collaborative proposals. Winning is sometimes not in our hands, or most of the times not in our hands when it comes to grant applications. Just wanted to also say that a few things that Monica said are also going to be repeated by me in my presentation. So I would look at that as kind of in some way endorsing some of the most important points. If you have heard this two same points said by both of us, I would take those as the key takeaway messages said by two different people working two different settings and who have not kind of spoken about this with each other. So we have not kind of tried to in any way coordinate this. Having said that, I also want to kind of give a disclaimer that I don't have a magic solution to getting winning applications, writing winning applications. What I do have is a lot of experience of writing failed grant applications, and I believe I learn a lot more from the grant applications that I've written where I don't get awarded than from the ones which get awarded. So disclaimer number one: no magic, no guarantees that if you follow what I'm saying here will get you the grant. But also to say that while I've tried to frame some of this within the larger addictions or alcohol research space, some of these principles apply to any kind of research grant applications. Okay, there's nothing much different about alcohol research in terms of these principles of writing grant applications, which would not apply to any other mental health or larger global health grant applications. And then finally, I would also want to kind of frame some of these examples or principles within my own personal experiences. So there's kind of some amount of anecdotal experience or anecdotal evidence to some of the things that I'm saying, just to kind of make it a little bit more real and live for all of you. And before I do that, I just want to kind of acknowledge my privilege. Okay, so in terms of my positionality, in that I kind of live professionally and personally actually as well between two worlds. So I work for an institution in the global north, and most or almost all of my work is in the global south. So I've kind of have that privilege of having all of the resources to kind of put together, the good competitive grant applications and the kind of support that comes from being in global north institutions. But also at the same time also have the privilege of having connections in the global south, and then in some sense being accepted more easily as someone from within that setting, which makes life, I must say, a lot more easier in terms of putting together collaborative grant applications. Having said that, I think one of the key starting points for any kind of research related to alcohol, even before all of this mess in the US and the kind of ripple effects and in other parts of the world in terms of less funding becoming available, historically, dedicated funding for alcohol research has always been very, very restricted. And people like us who work within that space have had been forced to kind of think, as Monica said, very strategically and how we are going to position our grant application. And trying to kind of, in some way, piggyback on applications which are focused on something else, which is related to alcohol use and alcohol use disorders, and then kind of doing the research in that sense. So Monica spoke about HIV research. I mean, very recently, I put in a grant application to the NIHR, which had a very specific dedicated call about injury, accidents and injuries. And I had kind of have these interventions that I've developed over the years to other small funding, which are text messaging interventions for hazardous drinking. And I wanted to do a trial of that. And I positioned that within this accidents and injuries themed grant call, where the intervention would be delivered within accident and emergency settings in India, with the outcomes that was being measured would be accidents and injuries. So kind of the call was not about alcohol, was about any kinds of accidents and injuries, and you kind of now piggybacking your idea onto what the funder is focused on. But another thing that I would also kind of put out there is when I'm talking about grant funding, I'm not always talking about big grant applications, okay? Because most of the time, many of us think about those, $5-10 million dollars or pounds grant applications. And in trying to focus on those who miss out on the smaller opportunities of these just little grants that can get you started off on your ideas and then gradually build up your kind of pieces of work towards a larger grant application, especially for early career researchers. So when I started off doing some of this work, I got little grants from the MRC, intervention development grant from the MRC, intervention development grants from Grand Challenges Canada, just kind of building up a portfolio to these smaller grants. So you build up a track record of grant, being grantsmanship, but also kind of building up things that you can then, test, let's say, in larger trials with bigger funding later. Some of the things that you need to definitely know is who are the funders within this space, specifically for alcohol, but also within the larger global health space. Who are the funders, both big and small? What are they interested in? And you have to keep an eye on these things, okay? Because this, what are they interested in, keeps changing over time. It's not kind of static. It kind of moves with developments in the larger global health space. What are their priorities? Like what do they want to focus on at the moment? So if you look at the larger global health space or global mental health space at the moment, you'll see that a lot of grant app calls are for young people's mental health. A lot of them are for digital interventions. A lot of the calls are for planetary health or climate change, right? So those kind of funder priorities you have to be aware of, but you have to also be aware of larger global health agendas as well. So it's not just about what the funder wants, but where is the larger global health space moving, and what are the kind of priorities emerging from there, and does your research align with that as well? But in no way am I saying that you should follow the money. Okay, one of the big risks is that then you keep following the money, like whatever the funders' priorities are, you forget about your own priorities. You just keep following the where the money is, and that's also not a great way of building up your career. But also to look out of the larger traditional research funder space as well, because now you're seeing a lot of philanthropic donors. You're seeing implementation funding coming from various donors, trying to think through some of those funders and getting out of the largely traditional research funding space, which also requires a little bit of creativity and strategic thinking, because many of these non-traditional funders are not really interested in our traditional research paradigms. They are more interested in implementation. They are more interested in increasing the reach of interventions, etc. So kind of leveraging those priorities, but then kind of getting in your research priorities built into it through monitoring and evaluation, etc. In some way, the bigger goal still remains what the funder wants, which is implementation and reach. But within that, you build in your research agenda. So don't get caught up only in the traditional research funders. So for example, one of the interventions that I have, which we have developed in our group, is called Me Sports, which is prevention of initiation of substance use and promotion of mental health through using sports. Now, that's not something that fits in with the priorities of your traditional funders. And we have been kind of getting sequential funding from various different philanthropic agencies to implement the program. But within that implementation, we are testing acceptability, feasibility, refining the intervention, with the eventual goal being that we'll apply to a traditional funder for research funding to do a trial. Building collaborations is tricky. There's no one way of doing it, and there is no one way of getting it wrong. There are multiple ways of getting it right, and there are also multiple ways of getting it wrong. And I think you kind of learn over time how to kind of build these collaborations. If I look back 10 years ago, I can think of an example when I was just starting off as a researcher. I got this kind of email from a very prominent researcher saying that, hey, we are putting this big consortium together in India. Would you want to be a part of it? And I did not know half of those people on that consortium, but I was kind of very keen to kind of, move forward and be a part of a big run and say, yes, let's do it. I'll be a part of it. And I think that becomes problematic sometimes when you don't know people, you don't know personalities, and that can sometimes be problematic. Sometimes you might get in with your eyes closed into collaborations, but most of the times I would, now having kind of learned my lessons over the years, I prefer to build collaborations a lot more organically. Getting to know people first and feeling comfortable working with them before saying that, okay, let's put together a grant application. Ensuring that I can work with them and they can work with me before kind of building these collaborative partnerships. But once you put them together, I think there are certain things that we have to be very mindful of when you're putting together, multi-partner, multi-country, global north, global south collaboration, that is shared relationship. There is kind of appropriate resource allocation, both in terms of people as well as money. The roles and responsibilities that are allocated are clear, and there is shared leadership and shared governance of the project. And then kind of the subsequent outputs and how you kind of ensure fair sharing of those through shared authorship, etc. I mean, all of those things have to be kept in mind. Well, budgeting and finance, and we can't run away from it. Many of us don't like doing this, but there's no way we can run away from this if we are going to kind of write grants and run programs. I think when we're building global north and global south relationships, and we need to understand that relation, when it comes to money, there is an inherent inequity built in how the systems are. Right? So for example, let's just take the example of funding from the US and NIH. NIH, things have changed now more recently, but NIH used to have a very clear way of giving indirects. Any institution in the US gets what they call as federally negotiated rates, which are extremely high. And any institution outside of the US, and in many cases, these are low and middle income countries, you get only 8% overheads, which is pretty minimal, considering that most of the work on many of these multi-country grants happen in the global south. So there's an inbuilt inequity in some of these systems. But I guess we have to, people who kind of working in both settings need to kind of ensure that in our dealings and in our conversations, there is transparency around how we have these conversations in terms of how we allocate resources, but also trying to understand what is important for our partners, right? Because sometimes our partners, let's say, for example, in the global south, might not be traditional research institutions. And their priorities might not be the same as you and me. My priorities might be, publications, making impact in policy, and all of conference presentations, etc. as an academic. But for the partners on the ground, that might not be as important. What might be important for them is sustained community engagement, building their profile and their reputation within the communities that they work with, engaging with policymakers in their country where it's going to make a change on the ground. So considering all of these kind of things when you are building your budget and doing your financial planning is very important, and not just thinking about the research process, because the priorities are sometimes different. Similarly, in terms of addressing ethical and practical challenges, right? The ethical challenges of doing some of the work in the global south are quite different. While the general universal ethical principles might apply, some of the challenges might vary in terms of both just alcohol research and otherwise, and how some issues that you encounter, let's say, for example, in the part of intimate partner violence in alcohol research, how those are seen within the context, how the culture, what are the cultural nuances in responding to those, might be quite different to what the global north has defined some of its issues, right? So keeping those into consideration when you are having conversations with your partners, and not being very dogmatic about some of these conversations, because then, if you're going to say this is the only way of doing it, regardless of what your context is, that's a surefire way of breakdown of negotiations and relationships with collaborators. Also, to understand that there are certain regulatory mechanisms within your partner countries in the global south which might be quite different and might be time consuming because of the bureaucracy in those countries, and keeping into account when you're developing a project plan, some of those issues is very important. So for example, if I'm doing work in India, I know that that there is, besides the ethics committee approvals from the host institution and the institution in country institution, there is something known as a health industry screening committee approval, which goes to the central government and they have to approve it. And that takes time. So I have to build that into my kind of proposal in terms of the buffer to start the project. So keeping in mind that we might have different priorities in kind of starting things, and in our understanding of how fast things should start might be quite different from the realities on the ground, which our partners in the global south will be dealing with. So being mindful of that and then building in buffers for those is extremely important. It's also important to remember that the kind of the primary ethics approval comes from the country in which you are implementing this research, which I have realized many country institutions in the global north which do not do global health research. Organizations which have a long history of global health research understand it, but there are new people coming into the space in terms of institutions wanting to do research in the global south. They many times do not understand some of the realities of global health research in kind of the global south, which means that there are lots of back and forth in terms of who does what, in terms of governance, in terms of budgets. So kind of being very mindful of these potential pushes and pulls that could happen, especially when your global north partner is an institution which is a lot more rigid in terms of its thinking around doing global health research, because this is probably the first or the second time or kind of that they are doing global health research. So just to be mindful of that. And finally, just thinking through the dissemination and policy impact that you building into your grant applications, because again, the priority is that you might have as someone from the global from a global north institution might be, in terms of dissemination policy impact, might be quite different from the requirements, needs, and expectations of your partner in the global south. Because in many times a global north partner might not be a long-term embedded researcher within that context. They come into the research and go back, but it's the local partner who is embedded within that context who has to continue within that setting. And then their priorities are around sustainability, building relationships within the communities, seeing change, sustainable change on the ground through policy change, etc. So designing your dissemination and strategies based on those requirements and not of the global south. So having those conversations right at the outset and understanding that context, I believe is very important. So I'll end there by kind of if you were to ask me to summarize all of this in a nutshell, then I think there are three important messages that I want to put out there. One is know your funder. very, very important. 2 is know your partner you are going to work with in the global south, extremely important. And the third one is know the context that you're going to work with. And for the latter two, knowing your partner and knowing the context, you have to wear a very active empathy hat when you do that. And you can't be kind of thinking, I'm kind of doing this from a perspective of a global north researcher, but trying to fit into the shoes of your partner in the global south and understanding them and their context is very, very important. Everything else will fall into place if you are able to focus on these things about understanding your funder, your partner, and the context. Thank you.